In 1965, you were only 16, a simple country girl who had just followed her parents from the farm to the city. Your eyes still sparkled with the innocence of open fields and vast skies. And then you met Walter. He wasn't just a young man. He was a promise of a stable future, a family, a better life that your parents had always yearned for. With his tall frame, confident smile, and the calloused hands of a hard-working man, Walter was the embodiment of security. To you, his job as a truck driver wasn't just a job. It was a road that stretched across the country, bringing stability back to the future home the two of you would build. Love came quickly, a whirlwind that swept you off your feet. 6 months later, you stood at the altar in a rented white wedding dress, hand in hand with Walter, and swore an oath you believed was sacred and unbreakable forever. Your mother had worried, saying you were too young, that you knew almost nothing about this man. But you brushed her concerns aside. You knew him. You knew his heart. You knew his diligence. And you knew the love he had for you. For a 16-year-old girl, that was all there was to know. The first days of married life were difficult, yet romantically sweet. You lived in a tiny room behind his aunt's house. The space was cramped, but it was filled with big dreams. Walter was constantly on long-haul trips from Chicago to Indianapolis, then New York. You were home alone, waiting. But that loneliness wasn't bitter. Each of his trips was a testament to his love and responsibility. Rosemary, I'm doing all of this for you and the family we're going to build, he would often say, and those words became your gospel. You trusted him completely. That faith was the foundation of your entire world. Then the children arrived one after another: Robert James, Linda Ann, and Kevin Patrick. Each child was a joy, a blessing, and also a greater responsibility on your shoulders. The small house was filled with laughter and crying, and you navigated a world of diapers, milk bottles, and sleepless nights. Walter was still on the road, and you happily accepted your role. You were the keeper of the hearth, the solid home front that allowed him to travel with peace of mind. And then Marlene entered your life, not in flesh and blood, but through Walter's stories. It was about 2 years after you were married. He told you about his only sister who lived in Indianapolis and suffered from a serious illness. He never specified what it was, only that it was severe, and she needed constant help. Rosemary, my parents are gone. It's just me and her. I can't abandon her, he said, his sincere brown eyes looking directly into yours. And you, without a moment's hesitation, believed him. You didn't just believe. You were moved. In your eyes, Walter's actions made him even more noble. It was the mark of a good man, dutiful son, a responsible brother. How could a man so devoted to his sister not be a good husband and father? So sending money to Marlene became an integral part of your life. Every month after getting his paycheck, Walter would carefully withdraw a significant amount of cash, smooth it out, and place it in a separate envelope. That envelope to you held an almost sacred meaning. It was a symbol of kindness, of family ties, of your husband's noble sacrifice. You were completely accepting. You saw it as an obvious duty. You told yourself that your family was luckier. You had your health. Your children were healthy. Marlene was not. Therefore, this sacrifice was necessary. It was right. But time passed, and the weight of life grew heavier. The three children were growing, and their needs multiplied. And that's when the first ripples of unease began to disturb the calm surface of your faith. You vividly remember one winter when Robert James, your eldest, kept begging for a new pair of sneakers. His old pair was worn through with the toes peeking out. Every time he ran and played, you worried he would trip or that sharp stones would injure his feet. You had promised him a new pair when his father got paid. The day Walter brought the money home, your heart was full of hope. But after he placed the envelope for Marlene on the table, the remaining amount was just enough to cover rent and food for the month. There wasn't a single dollar left over for a new pair of shoes. That night, after the children were asleep, you sat alone in the kitchen, silently stitching up the torn toe of your son's shoe. Each thrust of the needle into the worn fabric felt like a stab to your heart. You looked at the envelope sitting on top of the refrigerator. The money inside could buy not just one, but 2 new pairs of shoes for your son. A sharp pain rose in your chest, a bitter feeling of helplessness. Why did your son have to wear torn shoes while his father's money was being sent to someone you had never even met? A question flickered through your mind, a doubt as faint as mist. Was it worth it? But you immediately pushed it away. You felt guilty for having such a selfish thought. Marlene was gravely ill. She could be fighting for her life. What was a pair of shoes compared to a person's health? You scolded yourself and continued to diligently sow tears falling silently onto your calloused hands. You sacrificed because it was the right thing to do. Moments like that kept recurring. It was when Linda Ann was sad because she didn't have a new set of colored pencils like her classmates. It was when Kevin Patrick longed for a small toy you couldn't afford. Each time, your gaze would unintentionally drift toward that envelope, and the familiar ache would return. You had gently suggested visiting Marlene a few times. What if we go to Indianapolis for Christmas to visit her? The kids should meet their aunt. But each time Walter found a way to deflect. He said Marlene's illness made her dislike having visitors, that her environment had to be strictly controlled. We'll go one day, Rosemary, but now is not the right time. And you raised to be a good wife who never questioned her husband's decisions, accepted it. Your trust in him was so immense that it overshadowed all absurdity. You didn't find it strange that for over a dozen years, Marlene's illness never improved, but also never seemed to worsen. You didn't question why you had never once received a thank you note or a phone call from the sister-in-law your family was supporting. Your world revolved around your small home, your children, and your unshakable faith in the man who was the pillar of your family. To help with finances, you started taking in laundry and mending. Your hands grew rougher, your back ached after each long day. But you never complained. It was your sacrifice, your contribution to the family's shared sacrifice. Life went on in a cycle of acceptance, trust, and silent sacrifices. You were proud of your family, proud of your responsible husband, and proud of yourself, a dutiful wife devoted to her family. But the underlying unease remained. It wasn't clear, it had no shape, but it was like an underground river silently flowing beneath the foundation of your happy home. It was the empty feeling when he was away on a New York trip for a whole week longer than his other trips. It was the unanswered curiosity about Marlene's face. It was the pang in your heart every time you had to say no to your children's small wishes. You lived like this for 14 years. 14 years of innocence, of absolute faith, of unquestioning sacrifice. You had built your entire life on a promise, never once suspecting that its foundation could be a lie. You were still that 16-year-old girl, only now your eyes were etched with the fine lines of worry, and your heart, though still full of love and trust, bore small scars from nameless pains. For 14 years, your world was built on a solid foundation called trust. But in March of 1978, the first crack appeared, and from it, the entire foundation began to tremble, signaling an inevitable collapse. It started on an afternoon as ordinary as any other. You were packing for another one of Walter's New York trips. It was a familiar task, a ritual of love and care you had performed hundreds of times. You picked up his navy blue jacket, an item as familiar as his own breath, to check for loose buttons. And then your hand felt something stiff in the inner pocket. With harmless curiosity, you reached in and pulled it out. It wasn't a work note or a crumpled receipt. It was a handmade birthday card, decorated with colorful polka dots, looking cheerful and deeply personal. A vague sense of confusion began to creep in. Walter's birthday had been a month ago. You opened the card. The handwriting inside was soft and feminine. And then you read the words, words that would carve the first gash into your innocent heart. Happy birthday, my love. May God grant you many more years and the health to continue being the wonderful husband and father you are. With all our love, Marlene and Rebecca. My love, husband, father, each word was like a hammer blow to your head. Your heart began to pound erratically. Marlene, the sick sister. Why would she call your husband, husband, my love? And who was Rebecca? The name was completely foreign. You read it again and again, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was a mistake, a joke. But no, you suddenly remembered Walter's indifference on his birthday. The cake you baked, the gift you bought. He hadn't touched them, saying he was tired from a trip. Now you understood. Perhaps he'd had another birthday party, a real one. A cold sense of dread washed over you. This wasn't just confusion anymore. This was suspicion, a poisonous seed just planted in your mind. Trembling, you tucked the card into your apron pocket. A part of you wanted to throw it in Walter's face the moment he came home and demand an explanation. But another part, a newly awakened instinct for self-preservation, stopped you. You needed to know more. You couldn't confront him with just one ambiguous clue. The next day, when Walter left the kiss he placed on your forehead no longer felt warm. It was cold and distant. You smiled, hugged his children, and played the part of the wife seeing her husband off on a business trip. But inside, a storm was brewing. The following days were torture. Suspicion gnawed at you. You became vigilant, observing everything, yet maintaining a calm exterior. And then, on a Thursday afternoon, the phone rang, delivering the second blow, a much deeper and more brutal one. It was Star Road Trucking. They needed to speak with Walter urgently about a shipment to New York. You were surprised. "But he's already in New York," you answered confidently. "He left on Monday morning." There was a few seconds of heavy silence on the other end of the line. Then the man's voice came through, polite but firm. "Ma'am, that's impossible. The load he was supposed to take was only ready last night. He hasn't been scheduled for any New York runs this week." The floor gave way beneath you. The room began to spin. You tried to argue, your voice trembling. There must be some mistake, but you knew deep down there was no mistake. The lie had been exposed, laid bare. Your husband was not in New York. So where was he? The monthly envelope for Marlene, the convenient trips to Indianapolis, the birthday card, all the pieces began to click together, forming a horrifying picture. The shock was so great, it nearly paralyzed you. Suspicion had now morphed into a terrifying certainty. You were no longer confused. You knew you were being deceived. The only question left was how deep the deception ran. That shock didn't break you. It lit a fire, the fire of anger. You had to know the whole truth. Driven by a frantic determination, you began to search. You opened the drawer where Walter kept his papers, an act you would have never dared before. And there, at the bottom, you found it a checkbook from a different bank and an envelope addressed to Marlene with a street address in Indianapolis. This was it, the map to the heart of the lie. You copied the address, and in an act of bitter irony, you hid the slip of paper behind your wedding photo. The picture that captured the moment you vowed fidelity now concealed the evidence of the most profound betrayal. You knew you had to go. You couldn't live another day in this deception. The fear of what you would discover was immense, but the need for the truth was greater. You waited for Walter's next New York trip. You lied to your best friend. You took the small savings you'd hidden in a chocolate box. You put on your best dress, applied your makeup carefully, like a soldier putting on armor for battle. The bus ride to Indianapolis was a journey into hell. With every passing mile, your heart pounded harder. What would you find there? A reasonable explanation, or the complete collapse of your entire life. When you stood before the house in Indianapolis, a beautiful home much nicer than yours, you already knew the answer. The sign, Marlene's Atelier, was a slap in the face. There was no sick sister, only a successful businesswoman. And then the door opened, and you faced Rebecca, a girl of about 14, with Walter's eyes, with Robert James's eyes. When she called out, "Dad," the final fatal blow pierced through you. The appearance of Walter, his face transforming from self-satisfaction to absolute horror, brought you no satisfaction. It only brought a numbing pain. And then Marlene walked in beautiful, elegant, the woman who had lived in comfort on the money you and your children had sacrificed. The confrontation unfolded like a nightmare. With a strength you didn't know you possessed, you stood your ground. You presented the card. You spoke the truth. You watched Rebecca's world crumble just as yours had. You heard Walter's layered lies, his feeble explanations, and you felt a wave of resentment rise within you. The pain was no longer sadness. It was anger, fury. Anger for the 14 years of your youth that had been stolen. Anger for the deprivations your children had endured. Anger for your own innocence that had been so cruelly trampled. You looked at the photos on the wall. Walter, Marlene, Rebecca, a happy family moments that had been bought with your sacrifice. Your entire life was a farce. An elaborate web of lies had been spun, and you were just a puppet in it. When you heard Marlene say that Walter had told her you were a teacher with a good income who didn't need financial help, the bitterness in you erupted. He hadn't just lied. He had belittled you, turning your poverty and sacrifice into a part of his play. In that moment, in that chic shop, the naive, trusting wife, Rosemary, died. All that was left was a woman with a shattered heart, but with an iron will newly forged in the fires of betrayal. Your marriage was over. Everything you had ever believed in had crumbled. Standing in the rubble, you had only one thing left: the truth. And as painful as it was, you knew it was also the thing that would set you free. The bus ride from Indianapolis back to Chicago was the longest, most silent journey of your life. For 3 hours, you sat motionless, forehead pressed against the cold glass window, staring out without truly seeing anything. The landscape blurred past fields, small towns, all just meaningless streaks of color. The world inside you had completely collapsed, and the debris was crushing your soul. The pain was no longer a sharp knife. It was now a heavy, cold stone in your chest, making every breath a struggle. You didn't cry. The tears seemed to have run dry in that damned tailor shop. Instead, there was an emptiness, a terrifying numbness. 14 years. 14 years of trust, love, and sacrifice, all for an elaborate hoax. You had dedicated your youth to a lie. Desperation began to creep in, a venomous snake slithering into your mind. What now? What would you tell the children? How would they react, knowing the father they adored had another family, another child? How would you face the neighbors, your friends, the whole world? And the most terrifying question, the one that made you hold your breath: how would you survive? The meager savings hidden in the chocolate box, the paltry wages of a seamstress's assistant, 3 growing children, and another life growing inside you, a secret that had now become a burden instead of a joy. A sense of insecurity and fear enveloped you, a thick darkness without a single ray of light. You felt small, alone, and utterly helpless. When you picked up the children from Betty's house, you had to summon all your strength to force a smile. Betty looked at you, her eyes full of concern. "Rosemary, what's wrong?" she asked, but you could only shake your head, unable to speak. You were afraid that if you opened your mouth, all your anguish would burst out in a single scream. That night, after tucking the children into bed, telling them a fairy tale, whose words you couldn't even remember, you finally allowed yourself to break. You sat on the old sofa in the living room, shrouded in darkness, and you wept. You wept for the innocent 16-year-old girl who gave her heart to an empty promise. You wept for the devoted wife who had sacrificed silently for 14 years. You wept for your children, innocent victims, robbed of a whole family. And you wept for your unborn child who would enter the world without their father's acknowledgement. You cried until you were exhausted, until only choked sobs remained in the silent house. You waited for Walter. A part of you still hoped he would return, would face you, would offer some kind of explanation, however false. But he didn't come back on Sunday, nor on Monday. The feeling of abandonment was crushing, as if you were a worn-out, worthless object, discarded without a word. And then, on Tuesday, the final, most cowardly blow fell. A call from the trucking company. Walter had quit. He had simply left a letter of resignation without any explanation. He had vanished. He had chosen the most spineless path he ran. He had abandoned you and your 4 children without a second thought. In the moment you heard that news, something strange happened. The despair didn't deepen. The fear didn't grow. Instead, something inside you hardened. It was the final straw. There was nothing left to hope for and nothing left to lose. All that remained was a raw and brutal reality. And it was there, in the abyss of despair, that a new life stirred. Your hand unconsciously rested on your stomach. You felt the life growing within, a tiny being completely dependent on you. And then you thought of the 3 children sleeping soundly in their room. Robert James, Linda Ann, Kevin Patrick. They too were completely dependent on you. You were no longer Rosemary, the betrayed wife. You were a mother of 4. Survival was no longer a choice. It was a command. That heavy responsibility didn't pull you down. On the contrary, it pulled you to your feet. The pain of abandonment still hurt, but it was no longer the dominant emotion. It had been replaced by a fierce determination, an extraordinary will to survive, sparked by the boundless love for your children. You stood up from the sofa. You dried your tears. You looked around the small house, not with the eyes of a defeated person, but with the eyes of a warrior surveying her battlefield. You would fight for your children, and your weapon for survival was the very thing your mother had given you as a little girl, a needle thread and an old sewing machine. The skill of sewing, once just a side job to earn a few extra dollars, had now become your lifeline, the only way you could put food on the table. You sprang into action. The next morning, you hand-wrote small advertisements, clothing alterations, hemming and mending, affordable prices. You posted them at the local market on the church bulletin board. You pushed aside your shame, stood at the school gate, and told other mothers about your services. At first, the work trickled in. But you didn't give up. Every mended shirt, every hemmed pair of pants was a small victory. Every dollar earned was a declaration of independence. You worked Relentlessly, by day, you worked at the factory. At night, when the children were asleep, you sat at your sewing machine. The whirring sound in the dead of night was no longer the sound of exhaustion, but the sound of hope, of life continuing. Your living room transformed into a makeshift workshop filled with fabrics, colorful threads, and half-finished garments. Of course, the path was full of thorns. You faced the gossip of neighbors, the pitying or judgmental stares as your pregnant belly grew larger, without a husband in sight. You had to create a story that Walter had found a better job in another state to protect your children from shame. The lie pained you, but you knew you had to do it. In August 1978, your youngest daughter, Victoria, was born. The delivery was difficult, as if mirroring all the storms you had just weathered. But when you held that tiny being in your arms, looked into her angelic face, a new strength, a new resolve was born in you. You swore to yourself and to this baby girl that you would raise these 4 children alone, with your own 2 hands, and they would never lack the things that mattered. This period of your life was brutal, but it was also a metamorphosis. The pain and despair had stripped you of your innocence, but they had given you something far more valuable in return, your own hidden strength. You discovered you were more resilient than you thought, braver than you imagined, and capable of loving more fiercely than ever before. You were no longer the woman waiting for her husband to return from long trips. You were the one steering the ship of your own life alone on a stormy sea. And you knew that no matter how difficult it got, you would bring it and its precious passengers safely to shore. The months after Walter disappeared were a relentless fight for survival. You found a rhythm, a grueling routine of work and responsibility. The factory by day, the sewing machine by night, and squeezed in between were precious but exhausting moments with your 4 children. You stood on your own 2 feet, though your legs ached and your heart still bore unhealed scars. The initial despair had given way to a hardened acceptance. You no longer had time to mourn the past. You had to fight for the present. You thought your world had now shrunk to this small house, to the worries of putting food on the table and securing your children's future. You thought the chapter on Walter Marlene and Indianapolis was closed, even if its ending was bitter and unresolved. Until one evening, as you were feeding baby Victoria her last spoonful of porridge, the telephone rang. The sound was still a luxury, an unexpected connection to the outside world. You picked it up, and a voice, familiar yet distant, spoke on the other end. "Rosemary, this is Marlene from Indianapolis." For a moment, your entire world stopped. Marlene. The name was like a needle piercing the scar on your heart, awakening a dull ache. A cold, defensive feeling immediately washed over you. Why was she calling? What did she want? Was there news about Walter? A flood of questions and chaotic emotions rose up. You were surprised, shocked, and above all, hesitant. You didn't know if you wanted to hear what she was about to say. "How did you get my number?" You asked, your voice harsher than you intended. Marlene's voice, on the other end, was trembling, broken. It wasn't the voice of the elegant, confident woman you had met in the atelier. It was the voice of someone at the end of her rope. She told you that Walter had vanished from her life too, without a trace. Her shop was on the verge of bankruptcy. Debts were piling up. She and Rebecca were about to be evicted from their home. You listened, and something strange began to happen. As you heard her story, you no longer heard the voice of your rival. You were hearing the echo of your own story. The same cruel abandonment, the same financial fears, the same burden of a single mother trying to protect her child. You suddenly realized a profound truth. Your pain was the same. Walter hadn't chosen either of you. He had discarded you both. You weren't on opposing sides of a war. You were two victims of the same tragedy. This understanding didn't come as a rational thought, but as a jolt of empathy that ran down your spine. The wall of resentment you had built around your heart began to crack. You saw a reflection of yourself from a few months ago in her desperation, and then, without thinking, without any calculation, you heard yourself utter words you could never have imagined just minutes before. Come to Chicago. Silence hung on the line. Marlene was probably as shocked as you were. I can't, she stammered. So I'm here, you repeated, your voice more resolute this time. I know someone who needs an experienced fabric saleswoman. At least you'll have a job. When you hung up, the small kitchen seemed to spin. What had you done? Were you insane? Your own life was already a struggle. How could you take on the burden of this woman and her daughter? The woman who had enjoyed a comfortable life, paid for by the sacrifices of your children. You looked around. You saw your children playing. You saw baby Victoria sleeping peacefully in her cradle. You remembered the frightened look on Rebecca's face that day. An innocent girl caught in a web of adult lies. And then you thought of your mother, of her words, "In this world, women have to help each other because few others will." Your decision didn't come from logic. It came from the heart, a heart that had been broken, but because it was broken, it understood the pain of another broken heart. It was a selfless decision, an act that rose above personal pain to touch a greater humanity. You would not let hatred turn you into a bitter person. You would choose kindness. You would choose to shelter the other victims of this tragedy. 2 weeks later, Marlene and Rebecca arrived in Chicago with just a few suitcases and a mountain of shattered dreams. You saw them standing forlornly at the bus station, and you no longer saw an enemy. You just saw a mother and daughter in need of refuge. The first few days were awkward. You arranged for them to stay with Betty. You introduced Marlene to Mrs. Edith Wilson. Your children were confused and hurt. Robert James, with the sensitivity of a boy on the cusp of adolescence, asked you, his voice full of resentment. "Why are you helping them? Dad left us for them." You pulled your son into your arms, looking directly into his eyes, the same eyes as Walter's. "That's not true, son," you explained gently. "Your father left us because of his own bad choices. Marlene and Rebecca are victims just like us. And I don't want us to become like him, thinking only of ourselves. We have to be better than that. It was a difficult lesson, but gradually the walls of ice began to melt. Marlene, grateful for your kindness, found every way to repay it. She helped Linda Ann with her math homework and watched baby Victoria when you were busy. Rebecca, after a period of distance, started to warm up to your children. They discovered a belated connection, a sibling bond built on a foundation of tragedy, but one that was no less real. And then the real turning point arrived. Mrs. Edith Wilson decided to retire and wanted to sell her shop. It was a golden opportunity, but it was far beyond your financial means. That night, as you tossed and turned, a bold idea came to you. The next morning, you asked Marlene to talk. What if? You began your voice a little hesitant. We bought the shop together. Marlene stared at you, her eyes wide with astonishment. Become partners? Rosemary, can you really trust me that much? You looked her straight in the eye and spoke the words that freed you both from the past. You're not the one who lied to me, Marlene. He's the one who lied to us both. In that moment, the dynamic between you truly shifted. It was no longer about the helper and the helped, no longer about pity or gratitude. Now you were equals. Two women, two mothers, two warriors, ready to build a new future together. You decided to name the shop New Beginning Clothing. The name wasn't just a brand, it was a declaration, a promise of a life free from lies, a future built by the hands and partnership of two women who had been pushed to the brink of despair. The decision to help Marlene didn't just save her. It saved you. It freed you from the burden of hatred, transforming you from a surviving victim into a proactive creator of happiness. That turning point didn't just show your incredible maturity and compassion. It turned a story of betrayal into a hopeful saga of sisterhood and the power of a new beginning. New Beginning Clothing wasn't just a name. It was your vow, your manifesto for the new life you and Marlene were determined to build together. The early days were a symphony of exhausting hard work, harmonized by a powerful sense of optimism and trust. You were no longer alone in your battle for survival. Now you had an ally, a partner, and in quiet moments, you began to realize you had found a sister. The small shop became your world. You were the creative heart hidden away in the back room, where the whirring of the sewing machine was the soundtrack of hope. Your every cut and stitch didn't just create garments, they were weaving a new future. Marlene, with her grace and knowledge of fabrics, was the face of the shop. She greeted customers, arranged merchandise, and managed the books with incredible dedication. You were two perfect puzzle pieces, complementing each other, working in a silent harmony, built on a foundation of shared understanding. You worked from sunrise until late at night, long after the neighborhood had fallen asleep. Your hands were covered in needle pricks. Your back ached, but you never felt tired. For the first time in your life, you were working for yourself, for your children's future, and you felt an endless source of energy. You trusted Marlene completely, and she trusted you. There were no suspicions about money, no arguments over credit. There was only one shared goal to make New Beginning a success. Of course, the road wasn't smooth. You face the prejudice of a society not yet accustomed to two divorced women running a business on their own. You'll never forget the fabric supplier, a condescending man who always insisted on speaking to the man in charge. Marlene would just smile a smile, both polite and sharp, and reply, "You're speaking to her. In fact, you're speaking to both of them." In those moments, a warm pride swelled in your chest. You weren't just seamstresses or saleswomen. You were entrepreneurs. And then your efforts began to pay off. Word spread. Customers flocked to the store, drawn not only by your beautiful quality designs, but also by the soul and the story of resilience behind each product. The shop started turning a profit. For the first time in years, you could buy your children new things without having to pinch pennies. You could afford extracurricular classes and throw small but proper birthday parties. It wasn't just about material things. It was about freedom. It was about dignity. In 1983, you took a bold step, moving the shop to a larger location on the neighborhood's main avenue. You had to take out a bank loan, a huge challenge. But as you and Marlene signed the papers together, you felt no fear. You felt a solid confidence. You had weathered the greatest storm of your lives together. What was a bank loan? The new store was a dream come true. It was spacious and bright, with a large display window where you could showcase your proudest creations. New Beginning was no longer a tiny shop. It had become a destination, a respected brand in the community. Parallel to your growing career, your unique family grew closer. The children, after the initial shock, gradually accepted their new reality. They grew up together not as children from two separate families, but as siblings in one large extended family, albeit living in two different homes. Rebecca, with a maturity beyond her years, became the big sister that Linda Ann and Kevin Patrick admired. Robert James, with his quiet, kind nature, became the older brother Rebecca could always count on. You witnessed these magical moments of bonding with a sense of complete happiness. It was seeing Robert James patiently explaining a difficult math problem to Rebecca. It was seeing Linda Ann and Rebecca huddled together sketching fashion designs. It was Kevin Patrick telling a joke that made all the kids, regardless of whose they were, erupt in laughter. Walter had created division and lies. But from those very lies, you had cultivated a love that was more genuine and expansive. You and Marlene were two mothers sharing the burdens and doubling the joys. You attended parent-teacher conferences for all 5 children. You celebrated birthdays together, worried together when one of them was sick. There was no my child or your child. There was only our children. Your greatest joy was watching them grow, not just physically, but emotionally. They didn't grow up with bitterness or hatred. They grew up in an environment enveloped by love, hard work, and a living lesson in forgiveness. They saw their two mothers, two women who had been deeply wounded, build an empire from the ashes and create a family from the broken pieces. That was the most precious legacy you could give them. In the late 1980s, as your children entered adulthood, they began to become the new pillars of New Beginning. Linda Ann, with her natural design talent, brought a fresh, creative breeze to the shop. Kevin Patrick, with his charm and way with words, became an outstanding salesman. And Rebecca, after graduating with a business degree, applied her knowledge to professionalize the company's operations. One evening after the shop had closed, you sat in the office with Marlene. Outside, your children were still chattering as they cleaned up. You looked at the woman beside you, the one who had walked with you through so much. "Did you ever think we could make it this far, Marlene?" you asked. Marlene smiled a warm and satisfied smile. "No, Rosemary, but I am grateful every single day that we did." You had turned tragedy into an inspiring success story. Life had thrown betrayal, lies, and despair at you. But you refused to be drowned by it. You picked up every broken piece, and with an unexpected ally, you rebuilt not just a life, but an empire. That empire wasn't measured in money or business scale, but in the love, resilience, and pride of a family that had found its new beginning in the darkest of circumstances. And in that complete success, you found true happiness, a happiness that was deep, unshakable, and entirely your own. The 1990s arrived, bringing massive changes to the world and to your small but resilient family. New Beginning was no longer a developing store. It had become a solid enterprise, a pillar of the community, a living testament to the strength of two women who refused to surrender to fate. Life had settled into the peaceful rhythm you had always longed for. Your children and Rebecca were on the threshold of adulthood, each promising a bright future. You thought the biggest storms of your life were behind you, but life in its cruelty still had one final, devastating trial in store for you. It started quietly, like small ripples on a calm lake. You began to notice that Marlene, your friend, your partner, your sister, wasn't herself anymore. The woman who had always been the store's boundless source of energy started to seem tired. At first, it was frequent headaches she dismissed as stress. Then came a loss of appetite and a persistent fatigue that even days off couldn't cure. You worried, you urged her to see a doctor, but Marlene, with the selfless nature of a mother, always brushed it aside. "There's no time, Rosemary. It's the busy season. Rebecca has her final exams soon." Then one day, in early 1991, she collapsed right in the store, and the doctor's diagnosis came like a death sentence. A thunderbolt that shattered the peace you had worked so hard to build. Breast cancer stage 4. Your world collapsed once more. But this time, it wasn't a collapse of lies, but of a brutal truth. A sense of injustice washed over you. Why Marlene, the woman who had suffered so much, who had only just found tools and success? Why was fate so cruel? The following months were a battle filled with tears and pain. Surgery, chemotherapy, radiation. You went through it all with Marlene. The sterile, cold hospital room became your second battlefield. You watched your strong friend grow weaker each day, her beautiful hair falling out her body, withering from the harsh treatments. In that dark period, your relationship transformed, becoming something more sacred and profound than ever before. You are no longer just a business partner or a good friend. You became her caretaker, her sister, her sole spiritual anchor. You'll never forget the long afternoons sitting by her hospital bed. You would hold Marlene's thin, cold hand in yours, trying to transfer your warmth and strength to her. You would feed her soup spoon by spoon on days she was too weak to eat herself. You would read her the romance novels you both loved when her eyes were too tired. It was in those moments of intimate, painful care that you realized the circle of life had closed in a strange way. Years ago, Marlene had come to your door, weak and desperate. You had opened your arms and given her a place to stand. Now the roles were reversed. You were the strong one, the caregiver, the one wiping away the helpless tears from your friend's face. And you did it not out of duty or pity. You did it out of love, a deep love that had blossomed from the ashes of betrayal, a sisterhood not of blood, but forged by shared trauma and common victories. One afternoon, as faint sunlight streamed through the hospital window, Marlene turned to look at you. Her eyes filled with a deep sadness, but also sparkling with wisdom. She took your hand and said, her voice a whisper, "You know, Rosemary, when you showed up at my shop that day in Indianapolis, I thought it was the worst day of my life, but today I realize it was the best. That day freed me from a life of lies, and more importantly, it brought you to me, the best friend I've ever had." You couldn't answer. A lump formed in your throat. You could only squeeze her hand, and in that squeeze, Marlene understood everything you couldn't say. In that moment, you were no longer two women deceived by the same man. You were two souls who had found each other, healed each other, and become each other's true family. Your entire extended family rallied together. Rebecca, though heartbroken at the prospect of losing her mother, found an extraordinary strength to take over at the shop. Your children did too. They took turns visiting the hospital, bringing Aunt Marlene her favorite foods, telling her funny stories from school. They showed that the legacy of love and unity you both had built was truly ingrained in their souls. Marlene fought bravely for 4 years. There were periods of remission when she would return to the shop, her head wrapped in a colorful scarf, her smile still radiant. Her presence was an inspiration, a reminder of the power of the human spirit. But the cancer returned more aggressive than before. And in 1995, on Rebecca's 30th birthday, Marlene passed away peacefully in the arms of those she loved most, you on one side and her daughter on the other. Marlene's passing left a vast emptiness, a pain that nothing could fill. The store seemed to lose its soul. Your house seemed to lack its warm laughter. The grief of losing your best friend, your sister, your partner devastated you. But it was in those days of sorrow that Marlene's legacy shone brightest. You saw her resilience in Rebecca's eyes. You heard her laughter in your children's voices. You felt her love in the unbreakable bond of your family. The pain of loss didn't divide you. It brought you even closer. And you did something you knew Marlene would have smiled and approved of. You bought a bigger house one, with enough room for everyone. You extended an invitation to Rebecca, not as an act of charity, but as an affirmation. Your mother was like a sister to me, and you are like a daughter to me, Rebecca. Our family has never been normal anyway. When Rebecca moved in, your unique family was truly complete. You had fulfilled your silent promise to Marlene. You would care for her daughter as if she were your own. The pain of losing Marlene would never fully fade. But now, looking back, you realize that even in this final tragedy, there was a blessing. The battle with her illness and her passing gave you the chance to express the deepest love, forging your sisterhood into something immortal. This pain only highlighted an extraordinary truth. From the bitterest betrayal, two women had built an indestructible legacy of love, forgiveness, and a friendship that transcended both life and death. In 2005, at the age of 56, your world was no longer defined by the endless rumble of a truck on the highway or the whirring of a sewing machine late into the night. Your world had become smaller now, perfectly contained within the gentle sway of the oak rocking chair on the back porch of your large home. From there, you could look out over the vibrant garden you and Rebecca had cultivated with your own hands. The September sun was slowly setting, bathing the leaves in a golden light, and the air carried the sweet scent of roses and damp earth. You took a sip of warm ginger tea, feeling the heat spread through your chest as a contented smile naturally formed on your lips, lips framed by the deep knowing lines of time. This peace, you reflected, wasn't the tranquility of a lake that had never seen a ripple. It was the profound stillness of the ocean. After the most terrifying hurricane has passed, returning the sea to a state of clarity and deep wisdom. Sometimes, in quiet moments like this, the image of Walter would flash through your mind. No longer a haunting ghost, no longer a sharp pain in your heart. Now it was just the memory of a distant man, a character from an old, yellowed chapter of your life. The resentment, the fire that once consumed you, had long since cooled, leaving only the embers of understanding. You no longer hated him. Strangely, in a deep corner of your soul, you felt a peculiar sense of gratitude. You realized a truth that takes a lifetime to understand. Walter's betrayal wasn't the end of your life. It was the beginning. It was a cruel gift, a blessing in disguise. If he had never left, who would you be? You would still be Rosemary, the submissive wife, living in a small house, waiting for her husband to return from his trips, pinching pennies to patch her son's torn shoes. You would have lived your whole life in a gilded cage of innocence, never knowing the strength and breadth of your own wings. His departure didn't push you into an abyss. It forced you to learn how to fly. That betrayal took a husband from you, but it gave you back yourself. It forced you to unearth strengths you never knew you had. The resilience of a warrior, the shrewdness of an entrepreneur, and the grace of a mother willing to embrace children that were not her own. Without that pain, would you have ever found Marlene? The answer was no. And a life without the deep friendship. The sisterhood you shared with Marlene was a life you could no longer imagine. Walter had inadvertently brought you the greatest soulmate of your life. The circle of fate was ironic, yet perfect. The sound of children's laughter echoed from inside the house, pulling you back to the present. It was Clara Victoria's daughter and Mark Rebecca's youngest son. They were squabbling over a toy. The voice of Linda Ann, now a respected lead designer, gently mediated. A moment later, Rebecca stepped onto the porch, holding a light woolen shawl. "Mom, it's getting a little dewy out," she said, her voice as warm and caring as Marlene's once was. She draped the shawl over your shoulders. "Do you need more tea?" You shook your head, taking her hand. "Thank you, dear. I'll just sit here a little longer." You looked at Rebecca, the daughter fate had given you. In her, you saw a reflection of Marlene, her grace, her intelligence, and her kind heart. Raising Rebecca, loving her as your own, was how you kept Marlene's memory alive. That love was not an obligation. It was a privilege. Your legacy, you realized, wasn't just in the sales figures or the success of the New Beginning clothing brand. The store now run by a talented new generation, the creative Linda Ann, the charming salesman Kevin Patrick, and the sharp manager Rebecca, was a tangible legacy. But your true legacy, the most precious one, was right here in this house. It was your family. A strange family patched together from broken pieces, cultivated from the ashes of deceit, yet stronger than any simple blood relation. It was Robert James, your quiet eldest son, now a brilliant engineer, who always treated Rebecca like his own sister and would fix anything for her. It was your grandchildren who grew up with no concept of cousins, only knowing they were brothers and sisters under one roof with two grandmothers. You remembered the name you and Marlene had chosen together. New Beginning. At first, it just meant a new career, a new life for two women. But now, looking back on the entire journey, you understood its meaning was so much deeper. New Beginning was this family, a family that proved that from the most painful ending, a more beautiful and radiant beginning can be born. That love can sprout from the most barren soil of betrayal, and that forgiveness has the power to heal even the deepest wounds. Kevin Patrick came out to the porch holding a small plate with a few slices of apple pie. He was always the funny, warm one. "What are you contemplating out here all alone, Mom? Planning a hostile takeover of some New York fashion brand?" You laughed, a clear sound, free from any trace of past sorrows. "No, son. I was just thinking how lucky we are." He sat down on the steps beside you, resting his head on your knee like a child. "We're the lucky ones to have you." You stroked his hair, now flecked with gray. You looked into the house where the warm, yellow lights were on, where your children and grandchildren were gathered, creating a symphony of life and love. You had lived a full life, a life filled with innocence, pain, despair, hatred, resilience, forgiveness, love, and joy. Life had thrown its fiercest storm at you, but you didn't just survive. You learned to dance in the rain, and then you used that rainwater to cultivate a magnificent garden. Your legacy was not a story of revenge, but a hymn of rebirth. It was the lesson that sometimes the door that slams shut in your face does so only to open another path. A path you never would have dreamed of leading to a better, stronger, and happier version of yourself. The sun had finally set. leaving a glorious red streak across the horizon. You took a deep breath, feeling peace fill your soul. You had no regrets. You had turned the tragedy of your life into an epic, and in the fulfillment of your old age, surrounded by the love of your family, you knew that you had truly won.